Google Hangout. I'm John Dickerson. Today's conversation will focus on young voters, a constituency that rallied behind President Obama in 2008. This time around, the polls suggest that millennials still favor the president, but they're less engaged than they were 4 years ago. And like the rest of the country, young voters are feeling the effects of a weak economy and poor jobs numbers. Can Mitt Romney capitalize on their frustrations? We'll pose these questions to today's panelists, and we'll take a look at the issues that matter most to young Americans. Joining me in today's Hangout, Snyder, president of the Young Democrats of America, Lisa Stickan, chairman of the Young Republican National Federation, Kristen Soltis of Crossroads Generation, the new super PAC targeting the youth vote, Biko Baker, executive director of the League of Young Voters, and Heather Smith, president of Rock the Vote. Welcome to all of you. Thanks very much for joining us here today on this presumably youth-friendly format. Heather, I want to start with you. We're going to start by just trying to define the group we're talking about here. Rock the Vote is trying to expand that group, but who are the young voters that we're talking about who are engaged? And then define for me the group of people who aren't yet engaged, but who you're trying to reach.
Great. So it's great to be here. What we call the youth vote, or the young voters today, typically means those ages 18 to 29. As we enter this electorate, they are huge in number. So about 46 million eligible young voters who could cast a ballot this fall. That means that they're nearly a quarter of the entire electorate. So huge, huge population. A couple other things about them, they're incredibly diverse. So huge portions of that youth population are Hispanic or Latino, African American, so an incredibly diverse generation. And they're also what we call the millennial generation. So huge, diverse, and eager to get involved in the political process. As we look towards November, though, there's a few things of note. One, this generation is not registered to vote at the rates that they need to be. So as of the beginning of this year, only about half of them were registered. Again, that's not a huge surprise, because if you think about it, people turn 18 every single day. And in fact, there's nearly 12,500 young people who turn 18 every single day and need to get registered to vote. Plus those who have already registered often move every single year, whether they're changing their address at college or they're renting an apartment, they're moving around. So there's about 25 million young people that we need to register just to get them engaged in the upcoming elections. And then I'd say in addition to that, there are subsets of the youth population that really need to be targeted and spoken to feel like this whole politics, right, is relevant to their lives and addressing the issues of concern to them. And I know a lot of the panelists here with us today can talk about this specifically.
Biko, let me ask you on that question about reaching some of those 25 million young Americans. Why would they want to get involved in the political process, which, you know, poll after poll shows disillusionment with political leaders? And so what's the pitch to the 25 million?
Yeah, thank you for having me on this Hangout. But I always tell young people, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And you're looking at some of the statistics that are impacting young people, such as 38% unemployment rate, and you're seeing that young people are on the bottom of the socioeconomic scale. College tuition is going up. Pell Grants are being cut. So if young people really want to get serious about the growing power that Heather has talked about, then we have to get involved. And just a little bit more about the diversity of this generation. Last 2008, 58% of young African Americans turned out. It's the highest number of any youth demographic. This continued in 2010. You know, 24% of young people turned out, and 27.5% of young African Americans turned out, again leading the trend. And I live in Wisconsin. We just had a historic recall election last week, and 76% of young African Americans, or 76% of the city of Milwaukee, which is the youngest and blackest city in the country, turned out. So even though there is problems, there are huge opportunities for us to grow and change the country.
Kristen, you're working on trying to reach that younger group of voters with a more conservative message. What's the opportunity for those kinds of voters? What's the pitch to that group of voters from the conservative perspective?
So I think we've got an incredible opportunity here, because in 2008, I think Republicans weren't trying to speak directly to young voters. You know, and we saw it turn up in the exit polls. You see young voters really trended to Barack Obama and to the left. And I think that the opportunity now is to say, you know, you're graduating from college, you're facing an incredibly tough economic environment. If you want to do something like start your own business, you want to create iPhone apps, you want to be independent, you want to stand on your own. I think it's important for conservatives, if we believe what we say and we believe that our policies are going to lead to greater prosperity and that they're going to lead to greater freedom, that also means greater prosperity and freedom for young people. It's important, I think, for us not to concede the ground, not to give up on the youth vote, but instead to try to make sure we're at the table and having a conversation with these voters.
And Rod, now let me switch to you. President Obama did very well with young voters in 2008. It's a key part of his coalition. He still does very well in the Gallup polling and the Harvard polling. He's doing much better than Mitt Romney, and in fact, his margin has increased since last year into the polling into this year. So on the one hand, things are looking well for the president, but in interviews I have with students, even those who are out with the clipboards at OFA events, they talk about the difference between 2008 and 2012. I remember in 2010, when the president was not on the ballot, that some of those young voters who had gotten so enthusiastic about President Obama were re-watching his 2004 convention speech to kind of remind themselves of what had gotten them so excited about this president. So while he's doing very well and no doubt will win the millennial vote, there is nevertheless this weakening. Give me your sense of that.
Well, John, I think the president has shown a commitment to young people, not just during the 2008 campaign, but also over the course of the last 4 years, via the policies that he's chosen to pursue and the way that he communicates directly to young people. And so it's interesting because we've rarely seen a White House or an administration that has chosen to make young people such a central part of that. And we saw it in education, doubling the size of Pell Grants and fighting for student loan reform. We saw it in the healthcare reform bill. Young people are probably the largest beneficiaries of that bill. One of the segments, I think, just last week, 6.5 million new young Americans, the data is coming out, have health insurance that would not have otherwise without the healthcare reform bill. And so I think the president has been working very hard, and he's got a message that he can go out around the country, not just to college campuses, but to young families and young workers around the country over the next few months. And the numbers speak for themselves. The Gallup poll that came out a few weeks ago, the president leading Mitt Romney by 35 points for voters under the age of 30, because I think they realize that he's out there every single day working for this generation.
Lisa, what's your sense of the... oh, sorry, Biko, go ahead.
I think part of the struggle with the current administration is that there's not a big idea. Just take, for example, in 1961, JFK went to Congress and said, we're going to go to the moon. 8 years later, we were on the moon. What's our narrative for our generation? I think it's important for President Obama or Mitt Romney in their campaigns to dream big and explain to us what they're going to do that's going to change the problems that we're facing in our country.
Lisa, answer that question. What's the narrative from Mitt Romney for that generation?
Well, thanks. Actually, what Rod said is true. The numbers don't lie, and the numbers we have are Barack Obama's performance record. This time around, the difference between 2008 and 2012 is we have a record of Barack Obama as president, and if you look at that record and you look at those statistics, it's heartbreaking for younger voters. The unemployment rate for voters 18 to 29 is 11.6%, I believe. So these are staggering difficulties for those graduating college, looking for work, trying to carve their own future. And I think given that, that is why it's difficult for Barack Obama to form this narrative, because he only has his record to rely on. I think Governor Romney is trying to shape that economic message, a message of promise, and I think he's learning some lessons from the 2008 campaign. These younger voters are on Twitter, the new media, and I think the campaign of Governor Romney is making an effort to reach those voters.
One of the big things that I think these candidates need to keep in mind is that they can't just talk about how one another would lead to a worse future. I think each side needs to talk about what will they do, what will they present, and I think the message for Mitt Romney needs to be, we can do better. What is it that he's going to propose that's going to help get that 22-year-old recent graduate out of their parents' basement and into a good job? And if we can't craft, we need to be able to craft that narrative and explain that story, or we're going to have trouble winning the youth vote. But I think that story is one that we can tell.
Heather, why, if I'm a young person and I want to be engaged in the world around me and help, move the issues I care about. Why does it make more sense for me to participate in the political process and not work locally with, my neighborhood or friends, something where you can actually be engaged? Biko talked about if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. But can't you be at the table in some other process, which might be more fulfilling, and you might actually get something done?
Yeah, well, there's certainly great frustration with the political process right now. This sense that it just doesn't work for me, and we're seeing this in city after city and community after community. And we have our work cut out for us, going out there and saying, actually, you should participate in this process that right now you think is broken. But it is that act of participating which creates a sense of power. And while it is in fact for a national election, it's the work on the ground and in the communities where young people are talking to each other, registering their peers to vote, talking about what's at stake, asking those hard questions of the candidates, and getting engaged in the process. That happens on a local level. And so it is our work at Rock the Vote and with many of the others here to go out and give young people the tools that they need to start doing that work, to have those conversations, to get engaged. But at the end of the day, if the candidates sit there pointing fingers and yelling about who's doing a worse job, that is not going to make the political system feel like it's relevant to young people. So I would just echo what Kristen said, which is we need a debate of ideas. We need big ideas and a vision, something to inspire people for why this matters, why our politics matters, why our democracy matters, but also what it means to me and how these candidates can actually address solutions that I face every single day. And so if they're pointing fingers and there's partisan bickering going on, it's just going to turn more people off. If they're having debate about real solutions to the real problems of these young people today, you'll see turnout increase in November.
Biko, do you see any, one of the things that I picked up in some of my reporting, I was just in Iowa, and you hear a fair amount of this. In Iowa, President Obama, candidate Obama in 2008, that was where he launched the campaign. It was the spark of the campaign when he beat Hillary Clinton there in the caucus, and that was responsible, or I should say young voters were a big part of that. And there's a lot of feeling now that sort of there was all of this promise, and Rod did a good job of explaining specific concrete things the president is trying to do that millennial voters might care about. But I'm not sure that scratches the itch, and the itch is sort of that the president was proposing this kind of higher, loftier, maybe he was promising too much, but the difference between what he promised and what people expected, this kind of lifting narrative, and what they're getting and what they're seeing, that gap seems to be a real issue here. Do you see that in your conversations with young voters?
Yeah, I mean, definitely young people are feeling the economic crisis harder than any other demographic. And I think that when you look at the narrative that Obama built, I think it's up to young voters to decide if it's going to be a hope and change narrative or not. And I think we have to push both candidates. And I think the struggle for Republicans is that their narrative right now is that young people are stealing the vote, that young African Americans there's voter fraud, when every study shows that there isn't voter fraud. And I would encourage Mitt Romney, who has a history of being sort of a progressive Republican in Massachusetts, to really stand up and push back against ALEC around voter suppression and voter ID, so that our rights to vote aren't infringed upon.
An issue that's not central to the economic question here in this election, but it's one that Steve Schmidt, who ran the McCain campaign, said on the question of same-sex marriage, that if the Republican Party doesn't evolve on that issue, doesn't come to a position of essentially supporting it, that it turns itself off of an ability to get younger voters and will continue to do so. That on that issue there's a big generational split. Older voters tend to be more wary about same-sex marriage. Younger voters tend to be okay with it. Do you see it that way in Republican politics?
Not exactly. I think while there's many issues for consideration with this election, I think, as you call it, the itch is really unemployment. And I think the reason the Republicans have focused on the economic message is when you have recent graduates 53% under or unemployed, I think that's the main focus for most of these voters. When I travel the country and meet with young Republicans or interested, younger voters, a lot of the discussion centers around their concerns for their future. And while I think there are other perhaps issues that voters may look to, I think the primary driving force for the youth vote in this country is going to be the economic message. It is going to be their struggle to buy a house, get married, move out of their parents' house, those kind of factors. And I think that difficulty is really going to be central for turnout.
Kristen, leaving aside the question and the point that Lisa makes about turnout, do you assess Steve Schmidt's claim about the cultural issue of same-sex marriage and whether that, and again, this is Steve Schmidt, a Republican, ran the McCain campaign, and so not, some crazy liberal. Assess his claim and whether you think there's anything to it.
So, I think that in 2008, you saw young voters drift to Barack Obama, and it wasn't on the issue of gay marriage. I mean, up until a couple of weeks ago, Dick Cheney was actually to the left of Barack Obama on the issue of gay marriage. So the idea that either party is sort of homogenous in their view on this issue is incorrect. Within the Republican Party, we have a really healthy debate about what do we think about gay marriage versus civil unions versus traditional marriage, et cetera. I mean, this is a healthy debate within our party. And I do think that it's one where you're seeing the opinions across the country evolve, but I also don't think that that's going to be a decisive issue for young voters in this election.
Rod, what do you think? You mentioned some... Sorry, go ahead, Lisa.
I just wanted to add on Kristen's point, President Obama did shift his own views very recently, and also they're going to hold the Democrat National Convention in North Carolina, a state that clearly has spoken on the issue, both Democrats and Republicans alike. So I think Kristen's correct. This is an issue that is open to debate, but I don't think it defines the youth vote.
Rod, you mentioned a couple of specific things the President had done on issues, but when talking to White House advisors and people who are in the middle of the campaign, they said the President's announcement, his support for same-sex marriage, was something that younger voters who are looking for inspiration, looking for the Kennedy-esque message that Biko mentioned, that this was an issue that would remind them of the Barack Obama of 2008. Do you buy that?
I totally buy that, and I agree with it. The Young Democrats of America, a couple of months before the President came out with his announcement, was really pushing, not just behind the scenes, but publicly, for inclusion of marriage equality in the Democratic Party platform. We see this as an issue that within younger voters, it is a uniting issue. And also, if you just go back a year or two, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, allowing gays and lesbians to serve in the military openly for the first time, had about 80% support amongst voters under the age of 30. And Democrats clearly led the way on that issue. So when it comes to these fairness and equality issues, there is a big difference between the two parties. The Democrats have stood firmly on the side of LGBT rights. And I think the President's announcement is a big deal. The economy is certainly going to be central to this campaign. But I think when young voters go into the polling place and look at some of these social issues that do have a real impact on themselves and their friends and their families, Barack Obama is taking a position that is consistent with young voters, in a very broad way.
Heather, let me ask you a question. What is Rock the Vote's democracy class? What is the process of educating younger voters about the process? Take us through that a little bit, if you could.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, there's elections every 4 years where everyone pays attention to voter registration and turnout. And every 4 years, we face these issues where young people don't have the education about the process, don't understand where to register, when to register, that they even have to sometimes. And at the end of the day, where to go vote, in the process itself, it's just proven to be a huge deterrent to them actually participating. And so about 2 years ago, Rock the Vote started a program called Democracy Class. And the idea is to go into high schools as those juniors and seniors are, mostly the seniors, as they're preparing to graduate. We can catch those young people. They'll be the first-time voters in the fall. They'll be the ones eligible to vote in November. And we can teach them about the history of the right to vote, the power that comes with this vote, the importance of participation, and ultimately how to navigate that process. In many ways, it's like a driver's ed for voting. And we used to have civic education taught throughout our schools, but in more than 22 states in our country, funding for civic education has been cut. And the schools that are least likely to be teaching and preparing the students are those schools in lower income communities, public schools where their budgets have been slashed. So if we can get into those places, but really every high school, and prepare students now, we can have a very educated and prepared and registered electorate going into the fall of every election year. It's kind of like this dream of, one day, once a year, for 45 minutes, every high school in America educated their seniors about the elections and our process and our democracy, we would in fact have a very different democracy. So we announced it on March 23rd of this year. It was the day that the amendment which gave young people the right to vote was proposed by Congress. It was ratified in under 100 days, so we gave the teachers 100 days to teach the program. Anyone who signed up, we gave it to them for free. We shipped them their toolkit. It's artists telling the story of voting. It's animated videos. It's posters for the classrooms. It's fun stuff for the students. But at the end of the day, we're hoping to prepare an entire generation of young people in a scalable way to be educated citizens and really strengthen our democracy through increased participation. And it's been a huge success. Year 2, but we're already in over 3,000 high schools across the country. We've been in schools in every single state, and we're really excited to kind of continue and grow that with our partners in the years to come.
Kristen, Heather describes a kind of more general project, but I've wondered among conservatives and Republicans. I hear so much in my travels in going to rallies and talking to voters. You talk to middle-aged to older Republican voters, the touchstones, and particularly with the rise of the Tea Party movement, has been sort of civics 101 as they see it in America's founding and in the founders and their principles, which they think the federal government in particular have gotten so far away from. I wonder if you agree with Newt Gingrich, who basically said the only way we can kind of build a new set of voters for our party is if we in fact engage in a civics education lesson. And he had an entire program for this. He had an entire program for everything. But he thought that education and reminding people about the founders, voters of this age about the founders, was crucial to getting them as Republican voters. What do you think about that?
I think that it's important just to get people educated so that they will vote. I'd love for them to vote for the Republican Party, but it's more important to me that they turn out to the polls overall. I think that in general, educating people about why was, liberty and a very limited government so important to our founders? Why did they have sort of a skeptical view about the ability of the government to solve everything? I think that there is some value in that, but I also think it's important for Republicans to have a modern message. That, we can't just talk about the founders. We have to talk about the practical application of what we believe in to challenges of the modern day. So how, if we believe in our policies, how do our policies lead to better innovation? How do they lead to making us more competitive? I really think it's important to have that modern message as well.
Biko,
I can't wait for the Republican Party to really embrace that modern messaging, because the polling indicates that young people are more progressive than the Republican Party, especially around issues such as climate change. It's even though Republicans were the group that came up with cap and trade and then pushed it and blocked it in the Senate, I think what you see with young people is that we believe that we need to make a drastic impact and change in the way that we deal with carbon in our country. And unfortunately, we're also down with public transportation in my home state again. Scott Walker, right when he was elected in 2010, cut a huge investment that connected Milwaukee to this high-speed rail that would connect to Chicago and Minneapolis. And he cut it, and he said it was too expensive. And for young voters, what we heard is our future is too expensive. At some point, we have to make big investments, and I would hope that the Republican Party would get back to their values of fiscal responsibility and innovation.
John, can I jump in there as well?
Yeah, sure. Yes, please, Rod, go ahead.
I just completely 100% agree with what Biko just said, and I think it's a big part of the polling and data showing that voters under the age of 30, only about 10% identify with the Tea Party movement, and I think it's for a lot of the reasons that Biko just talked about. You see Mitt Romney and the increasingly conservative Republican Party, the big emphasis is on tax cuts for the top 1%. And I know it sounds cliche, but it is a central part of the platform. And what's getting cut are investments in clean energy, jobs, infrastructure, and education. And so what you have is you have a generational transfer of wealth away from investments in our generation and young people who are under the age of 30. That's why young people are not buying into this sort of austerity message that the Tea Party is presenting. It it doesn't leave anything for us. And you know, I mean, not trying to create a generational war here, but we have to have honest conversations about how these policies that the Republicans are proposing end up affecting young people.
But ultimately, I mean, the Tea Party wants to spend less money overall, and so if you're spending less money, that's less money you're borrowing from the future. So I would actually argue that on these fiscal issues, Republicans have a really strong message to make to young people about how every year, you know, 2009 was a really bad fiscal year, and since then we've repeated it in 2010 and 2011 with really high levels of spending. And so is this sustainable? And to the extent that Republicans think it's not, I mean, that's a message that I think really is targeted directly at young voters who are concerned looking at the national debt growing and going, I know it's going to be us that are going to have to pay for this. Is anybody at all concerned that we're spending so much?
Well, Kristen, go ahead, Biko.
The problem with that narrative is that's not historically how the United States has gotten itself out of economic trouble. If you look at the post-World War II or the post-Depression era, we invested in infrastructure and got ourselves out of trouble. And I think it's a false narrative that America is broke. We're not. We have the innovation and the technology to lead the world and the nation once again. But as long as we don't invest in young people, we can't do it.
Lisa, go ahead, Lisa, please.
To that point, I was going to say the message of the Republican Party is we don't want to spend more than we take in. We're trying to be fiscally responsible. And I'm from Ohio, a state where they also were looking at the high-speed rail. And ultimately, the governor does have to make that call. If there's not enough money to afford this rail, you know, you don't go with it. And I think that's the message Republicans, the Tea Party, and I think younger voters can relate to because the debt is mounting.
You know, I think that's right, Lisa, and to the extent that the younger voters, from a policy standpoint, are the ones who are going to get stuck with the bill if, and it's the fiscal situation will be far worse by the time they're, you know, 10 years down the road. But it has always struck me, and I remember 20 years or so ago, there was a movement to try to convince that generation, Gen X, I guess it was called at the time, that the debt was that generation's version of Vietnam. In other words, a perilous threat that everybody needed to rally in the streets to confront, and it just never worked. It never sold, and I did some reporting about it at the time, and people just didn't take to it. And I wonder whether, you know, while there may be a substantive argument that you can make, if younger voters require something that has a little bit more aspirational kind of music to it than just the kind of cut and make smaller and fiscal responsibility.
Yeah, I think that the idea of just cutting is something that a lot of young voters will look at and they'll say, I see how that's good for me long out in the future, but it doesn't necessarily have an answer to how does that make my life better off today. And so I think to the extent that Republicans need to focus on the unemployment issue and how are we going to make it easier for a young person to start their own business, how are we going to make sure that the factors that are driving college costs up through the roof, that we don't just ignore that we allow, that, you know, for instance, if you look at healthcare, healthcare costs keep going through the roof, and this healthcare law is going to require young people to purchase insurance that's going to cover a lot of things they don't need. So I think there's a lot of stuff where we can say, here's what we believe about how free markets work, and here's how conservative values can apply solutions to these problems to solve things in a short term as well.
Still, though, it doesn't seem like it has that, you know, because then the Democrats can counter by saying, well, but you're going to be able to pay picked up on your parents' health care plan, so that's our sort of tit for tat. If it seems to me the challenge is greater for Republicans than Democrats to pick up a greater share of younger voters, because you've been on the kind of wrong end of that. You don't think it requires a kind of a more kind of dramatic message? I mean, John McCain certainly tried that. He tried to embrace climate change as a way to talk to younger voters that kind of reached for the highest and best rather than specifically making the fiscal conservative argument.
I think it has to be positive and it has to be aspirational, and that's why I think by talking about how our policies can create more jobs, that's the message that's going to be the bigger, more resonant message this cycle.
Biko, go ahead, please, Lisa, on that point. Sure.
Really quick, if I can add, my hometown is Cleveland, Ohio. President Obama is here. I find it very interesting he's going to a community college campus to meet with first-time voters, many of them, and I think that sends the message he's going to take this hope and change message to them, but he really needs to meet with these post-college graduate voters and really talk to them about what he's done for them and what he plans to do for them. And along those lines, I would suggest that Governor Mitt Romney is doing the same thing, trying to get out, meet voters, connect with the younger voters, and share with them his vision for the future.
Biko, you deal with or target your efforts towards some non-college type voters. I mean, what's the path? You know, it's one thing to talk to people who've been through college and say, well, you're not going to, you know, talk about their economic situation. But what's the argument? How do you talk to a voter and convince them that life's going to get better if it's a non-college young person?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough for young non-college youth, especially young people of color. The economic situation hits them the hardest. But I think you talk to young voters from the non-college community and from the inner city community the same way that you talk to voters. You just go out and talk to them. Unfortunately, both parties have underinvested in young people of color because the narrative is that they don't turn out. But if you look at the numbers, and numbers do not lie, young people of color and even young black voters from non-college backgrounds are turning out to vote. And I think it's incumbent upon us to not wait for any elected official. We have to go out here with our narrative. We have to raise it up. And I would, at the League, love working with Republicans, Democrats, Greens, Independents. We have to do something that's innovative to get us out of these problems.
Is that what you mentioned, 76% of young African Americans turned out in the Walker race? Why was that number so high?
Well, it was 76% of the city of Milwaukee turned out. Milwaukee had, according to census statistics, is one of the blackest and youngest cities in the country. And the reason why people turned out is because they were plugged in. There were large canvassing outfits. People were tuned in to Facebook. And we've done a good job in our community. All the organizations have done a great job of constantly reminding people why it's important for them to get involved in the civic process. There's no magic. We just got to do it.
All right. Well, now, as we wind up here, I'm going to ask Rod and then either Lisa or Kristen, since both of you would represent or going to represent the conservative Republican view, but I'll start with you, Rod. I'm a young voter. Let's say I'm undecided. Why do I want to vote for Barack Obama?
I think it's important to take a look at the president's record. We all want to talk about the president's record, so let's talk about it. In the last 2 years, we've seen 4 million new jobs created in the United States. Youth unemployment numbers have actually fallen by 3 percentage points. We have ended the war in Iraq, which was so critically important to this generation. One of the reasons why so many young people turned out and voted for the president in 2008 was because of what was happening in the Middle East, and we're moving in such a positive direction as far as ending a conflict that was very unpopular to young people. You know, you look at increased access to health care and investment in education, and then you contrast that with a Republican Party that does not have a plan for investing in our generation. That's the message that we're leading with. And last but not least, Biko's mentioned it, and I think it's critical. This Republican Party has basically, in a lot of ways, given up on trying to convince young people that they're right, and they've moved to this voter suppression tactic. You've seen states that are making it far more difficult for young people to access the ballot box. You know, not just photo ID, but prohibitions on students voting where they go to school. This is the mentality of the Republican Party. They're not convincing young people to move their direction, so they're actually making it harder to vote, and it's a message we got to get out.
All right. Now, Lisa, would you give me the case for why, as a young voter, I should vote for Mitt Romney?
Absolutely. I think, as Rod said, let's talk about the record of Barack Obama. 53% under or unemployment. 1 in 5 young voters without a college degree cannot find employment. These are staggering numbers, and these are the realistic state of our country right now for younger voters. I think given the message Governor Romney is trying to put out there of economic prosperity, job creation, I think that should resonate well with younger voters.
All right, and actually I'll try one other question to get the last 2 in here. Kristen, what question should a young voter have in their mind? If they're evaluating the candidates, what questions should they have in their mind?
I think the questions they should have in their mind are, what are their plans to help ensure that I can get a job? Why is it hard for me to get a job? Is it hard for me to get a job because businesses are uncertain about the future that they face and they're unsure if they want to hire me? Is it tough for me to get a job because it's tough for me to start a business of my own? I think if people really think clearly, why is it difficult? Why is my generation having to move back home with our parents? And they really think think about what policies are going to be in place to help make sure that they can get a job, I think those policies of limited government and less spending are the policies that get them there. So I think that the most important question to ask is, what are you doing to help me get back on my feet? How can you make sure that I can do better?
And Biko, the last question comes to you, and it's the same one, which is what question should a young voter have in their mind as they're sitting down to try and figure out who to vote for president?
I think young people need to first understand that this is an important process. We have the numbers to swing and turn elections out, and we have to talk about our future. And I agree with Lisa and Kristen about jobs, but we can't get there without innovation. We can't get there without investment. We're not broke. We've gotten out of these problems before by investing.
All right. Thanks to all of you for joining me today.
Thanks.
That's all the time we have.